Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 116 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. It's another hour-plus conversation between myself and author John Mulhall, so I'll skip the usual intro and get right into it. The first couple of scenes in this episode of Moon Knight don't feature the title character, but are important nonetheless, and that's where we start our conversation. I like how it opens and the camera's kind of focusing in and out, like it's the POV of the camera that's taking her picture for the fake ID.
Agreed. The whole sequence I thought was interesting to see her interaction with this forger and obviously the history there and the way it's shot. I enjoyed that as an opening.
Yeah. And the forger there mentions her father being an archaeologist. So again, we have those parallels between Layla and Marlene from the comics.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of that. The story that you've talked about, I think that'll have more repercussions as we go along. It seems to be going that way.
Yeah, we've definitely gotten more hints towards that in this episode, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that point. But other than that, not a whole lot in this conversation that I needed to talk about. If you have anything you
I think it's pretty straightforward. We get to learn a little bit more about Layla, which is nice. We get to, we know that she's from Egypt and that she's, got some bad business there and not everyone's happy to have her coming back. And I love that there's, they're giving us more of a sense of a backstory for her and for Marc and kind of fleshing them out a little bit. So I have no complaints and I loved the opening and I was ready to get into the show.
Yeah, me too. So after that bit with Layla and the Forger, we get the Marvel Studios logo, of course, and then we get a second scene that doesn't involve Moon Knight at all. We cut to Harrow and his people walking through the desert, using the scarab to locate the tomb.
Yes, I like that scene as well. It started to evoke for me, and I guess it's natural for this to happen because of the location, but Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of, they're hunting for a hidden tomb and, love the supernatural aspect of it, but it's cool to see like this, we're going to set up a dig site out in the middle of the desert. And, Raiders is one of my favorite films of all time. So,
me too.
When I start to feel that kind of throwback to those kind of adventure films that I grew up with, I love it.
And I think we get even more of that in a little bit. But yeah, you can definitely feel the indie vibes going on here.
Definitely.
I wanted to note, this obviously was not my discovery, but there's a video by a YouTube channel called New Rock Stars where they talked to an Egyptologist and got a translation for the hieroglyphs that are on the scarab.
Oh, interesting.
And it is an actual passage from the Book of the Dead, and it says, "O Khepri, amid his boat, primeval one, whose corporeality is infinity/eternity, may you rescue Osiris Amenhotep, true of voice."
Huh. Well, what the heck does that mean?
Well, Khepri is the god of the morning sun, and he represents resurrection. And Osiris is the judge of souls. We talked a little bit about his representation in Egyptian mythology in one of the earlier episodes. So it is talking about resurrection and bringing Osiris back. And I found it interesting. Now, it may be just they didn't have a real passage from the Book of the Dead that mentions Ammit, but I did find it interesting that for being a scarab that is supposed to be leading to Amit's tomb, there is no mention of Amit anywhere on the scarab.
Yeah, very peculiar.
Yeah. Now, obviously, this is not the kind of detail that the average person is going to be able to discover, even freeze framing and looking at the scarab. This isn't something you can read normally. So it may be that they just kind of took a random-ish passage from the Book of the Dead. But it is nice that they are at least going to that level of detail.
Agreed.
That they're not just picking random hieroglyphics and putting the equivalent of gibberish on there.
They're not making things up.
Right.
I mean, it does sound like maybe they just kind of, well, this sounds like an interesting passage, and then, it has good characteristics, but I agree with you. It doesn't have anything specific. It feels a little bit more random.
Yeah. But who knows? We may find out that Khepri and Osiris are important later.
Well, I mean, we'll talk about this, of course, in a little bit. I do think it's interesting that some of the Ennead is not represented in the show when we get to that point,
Yeah, I made some extra notes about that specific scene, and we'll definitely talk about it when we get there.
Yeah, cool.
But meanwhile, while Harrow is celebrating their finding of the tomb, or at least its approximate location, they'll need to do some digging to get to it, Marc is running through the streets of Cairo, or actually on the rooftops of Cairo, to be more accurate.
Exactly.
Trying to track down where Harrow has gone. And he finds 3 of Harrow's men, who unfortunately have just killed the man that Marc was wanting to talk to. And we get our first real action scene of the episode with the knife fight between the 3 of them and the unarmed Marc.
One thing this show does really seems to do well is start us in the middle of action and then kind of drop us right into things, and then they assume that the audience is smart enough to figure out what's going on and spare us the setup and the preambles. And I appreciate that. I love that we don't have to see him get to Cairo. I mean, he was there at the end of the last episode, and now he's right in the midst of things. We didn't see him hunt this guy down.
Yeah.
We just know that it was someone he wanted to talk to, and now that guy's dead, and good. On with it.
Yeah. And then the fight itself, I thought, was one of the best melee fights we've gotten in the TV shows from Marvel so far.
Yeah, I like that he seems to have a very specific fighting style, Marc. He's aggressive, but without being ruthless, and also very defensive. And sometimes with certain action movies or action franchises, it feels like you've got one fight choreographer and you kind of see that person's fight style in everybody. And it was nice to kind of see, all right, this is a different sort of approach to the action, and doesn't feel like Black Widow or Captain America, or so it was cool to see kind of he's doing his own thing and he's got his own style. I like that.
Yeah, definitely. There were a couple of moments that I wanted to specifically call out. The first was when Marc is fighting the youngest of the 3. There's a moment where it looks like he's going to punch him in the face.
Yep.
And then he kind of pauses and goes open palm rather than a full-on punch.
Right. It's great that the action reveals character. That's exactly that's good action.
It shows, like you said, that Marc isn't completely ruthless. He sees that this is a kid and doesn't want to destroy his face or punch him out entirely. He's willing to pull his punches. And then the other moment was kind of a humorous moment for me when the one guy is showboating and goes to lick the knife.
I love that.
And Marc takes advantage of that and is just like, boom, right in the face, punches him mid-lick.
Another little echo of Raiders where the guy's showboating with the sword and he shoots him, and it's like, hey, don't show off in the middle of a fight. I'm going to put you down, and I dug it.
Yeah, that's a lesson that everyone should learn is when you're in the middle of a fight, it is not the time to show off. This is when you get down to business. That fighter, that one of the three specifically, was much more showy overall.
Right.
Throughout the entire fight. He does that little circle and kind of the dance
and Mark mentions, are we dancing or are we fighting,
Yeah.
So right from the start that guy was a showboater.
Exactly. And that was definitely a mistake on his part. And Mark takes advantage of that moment and is able to get the knife up against the throat of one of the guys he's fighting against. And that's when Steven kind of inserts himself into the fight. He makes his presence known and he says, "Stop, don't do this." And for a second, you think that maybe Steven took over, because we get that moment, what is now kind of trademark sound and camera fluttering as one person loses control of the body, and then we immediately wake back up and Mark is back in control, but he's in the back of a cab.
Yeah.
And so I think the assumption at that point would be that Steven took over.
Yeah.
But
I think it might be a correct assumption, but maybe not. We'll see.
I think not, because, well, there's a couple of things, but the first big one is when he's in the cab and they are driving along and he happens across two of those guys again. When he comes out and reapproaches them, they're like, "Whoa, hey, we don't want any part of this. Just let us be." So I think that whoever took over was even more brutal than Mark is, and that's way more brutal than Steven ever has been shown to be. And the other thing is Mark is in the back of a cab when he wakes up.
Yeah.
And if you remember, the third of Moon Knight's personalities, Jake Lockley, is a cab driver as his normal occupation.
Right.
And so even though obviously the guy driving the cab isn't Jake, but associating his first appearance with a cab in that way, to me, points towards it being Jake as the third personality that got brought out during that moment.
There's clearly a third, more violent personality here.
Yes, definitely.
That the two, kind of address and then never talk about again. Obviously it's somebody who's more ruthless, but I feel like, when he wakes up in the cab driver acts kind of aggressively toward him and says, "Oh, now you speak
Arabic.
Yeah,
Why
Arabic.
were you pretending to be a foreigner earlier?"
Yeah. And I'm wondering if maybe, if Jake appeared on the roof, maybe Steven is the one that put him in the cab, because they're also heading to the airport and it seems like he's the one that wants to get the hell out of Dodge. But there's definitely some other, presence at play. So it'll be interesting to see how much they reveal to us about what took place.
Yeah, you're right. It could have been Jake that took over immediately during that fight, and then Steven took over after that fight was over and is the one that got them in the cab.
I can't help but think that Steven wants to get them away from danger, get them on a plane and get them going home. But I definitely think that Jake is the one, or Jake or somebody. And that's the other thing I want to talk about is there's definitely a third personality, at least a third personality. But I wonder how much, they clearly weren't anything like Steven is nothing like he is in the comic books.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much Jake is going to be like he is in the comic books. In our very first episode, we were talking and I was making the case for Steven being an alter. And you were saying, well, typically people create stronger personalities for themselves if they feel threatened.
Right.
And I'm wondering if maybe both things happened here, where maybe Mark is the main personality and he created Steven, which is at one end of the spectrum. And now maybe he's created some third personality that's like at the darkest part of him, that is the protector alter that comes out. I'm spitballing, but I think maybe we're going to see that Jake, if that's who this personality is similarly not like his comic book counterpart. They're definitely playing fast and loose with the comic lore.
This is true. And yeah, I agree that if this third personality is called Jake Lockley, he doesn't seem to be much like his comic counterpart, who was just basically kind of a simple cab driver, would use his contacts on the street in order to find out what's kind of going on in New York.
Yeah. Kind of the street smart one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he was never shown to be as brutal as this third personality in the show appears to be.
Yeah.
But, we kind of skipped ahead a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, that's on
No,
me.
that's totally fine. We don't need to do things in chronological order necessarily, but I definitely want to go back to the chase scene on the streets between Mark and the two fighters that we met earlier, because that's really got that Raiders of the Lost Ark vibe to it.
Definitely. Not a whole bunch of people carrying baskets, but might as well be. It's what I dig is that so often it seems like filmmakers take Egypt and we have a kind of a stereotype of what we think of Cairo being, that, and it's what we remember from movies like Raiders Lost Ark, or even like Casablanca, or just the
Lawrence of Arabia.
Not that that's Cairo, but it's just we have these kind of archetypes and we keep revisiting them. And you had made a comment about they're not shooting with that kind of filter, and it's cool to see this similar kind of foot race through the city, but actually have it feel like a modern version of Cairo.
Yeah, with all the cars and trucks, but still having that like street market kind of thing going on at the same time. Again, the fact that we have an Egyptian director, Mohammed Diab, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I apologize if I did not.
I couldn't tell you one way or the other.
But, having an Egyptian director there is going to give a much more authentic feel to these scenes taking place in Egypt. And so that whole chase sequence with them running through the streets was very Raiders of the Lost Ark, but at the same time very modern and felt like something that could be taking place today.
Yeah.
And in the scene, Mark catches up to one of the men and is starting to threaten him again when Steven says through the reflection, there are mirrors everywhere.
Yeah, I was going to say the real problem
Egypt,
is
apparently
the real problem is that he's fighting around mirrors. He just needs to stop fighting around mirrors, and then he'll be fine.
Whether it's the reflection in the knife or the mirror on the wall at the store that he happens to be in front of. There are reflective surfaces everywhere, and at that point, Steven says, "No, don't do this," and Mark gets attacked from behind, and we once again get a blackout as Mark loses control and then comes back into control right after having stabbed one of them in the gut in a completely new, different location. So even though we're getting Mark's point of view now, we're still getting those scenes like in the first episode where it comes out and comes back in and suddenly everything has shifted,
losing spaces of time and jumping around. And it's cool to have that contrast of seeing it happen to Steven in the first episode. Now we're seeing Mark's POV on everything, but the two of them arguing internally about you did this, no, you did this, really, I think makes it clear to us, the audience, that
there is a third.
Yeah.
And one assumption could be that it is Khonshu himself, but I don't think that's the case, because we see later what it's like when Khonshu inhabits, and that seems to be very different.
And new to him at that point. Yeah, obviously, I don't know if they've changed it for the show. I don't know if it's like this in the comics, but it doesn't seem to me that Khonshu's power worked that way, that he could be an actual personality in Mark. They certainly haven't led us in that direction. It seems like he's very dependent on Mark and the alters to enact his, there's been so many times where he's like, in the background going, do it, and you think that if he was
if he was able to, he would just take over and do it.
Right.
Yeah. And so in the scene, Khonshu says, hang him over the ledge.
Right.
Threaten him. He'll definitely talk at that point. Because at this point, 2 of the 3 fighters from earlier are now dead, and only the youngest is still left alive. And again, you can see that Mark doesn't want to actually kill a kid and is very reticent to take him to the ledge. But Khonshu's like, don't worry, he'll talk.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out not so much.
Yeah, he didn't so much.
Whoops. It's another one of those very dark humor moments where after the kid cuts the scarf or whatever it is that he's being held up by and falls off that ledge, that moment where Khonshu is like, I really thought he was going to talk.
Yeah.
It's dark humor, but it's humor nonetheless.
It was definitely amusing, but I also found it enlightening that, he comes across as being kind of all knowing. If you do this and that'll happen, and do this. In this case, he's take him to the ledge, he'll talk. And it's like, he's just another presence in this fight. He's not all knowing. He doesn't know any more than Mark does. And he's got his own agenda. And again, someone who's piecing this together just from the show, it's like, oh, okay. He doesn't really have that much power, and he doesn't have vision. He doesn't have prophecy. He just wants to enact his will, and he has his agenda, and sometimes it doesn't work out.
Yeah. He thinks he knows what's going on, but he's not omniscient.
Yeah.
He can't see in other people's heads to necessarily know how they're going to react in any given situation.
He's basically a micromanaging boss.
Which, again, you mentioned in our last episode that Khonshu's kind of a dick.
He is kind of a dick.
And this is more evidence towards that. I mean, his attitude when the young man dies is very uncaring. It's very, thought he was going to talk. Oh, well.
Yeah, what's next?
Let's figure out what's next. Exactly. And so Mark and Khonshu kind of sit down and talk about what is next. And Mark suggests getting the gods involved, and Khonshu doesn't want to at first because he knows that if things don't go his way, they're going to imprison him in stone. But at the end, that's exactly what Khonshu does do. Mark asks, do you have any good ideas? And says, no, I have a bad one.
I have a bad one. Yep.
And causes an eclipse, which I'm sure scientists in the Marvel Universe are going to be trying to figure that one out for the next decade or so.
Yeah. At this point, after Thanos and everything, you just got to figure, everyone's like, what now? Like, what is going on? Something else what is this nonsense? I also love that scene because it shows if there was any pretense in the first episode and a half that this was not happening in the real world, I feel like that's completely gone by episode 3, because you don't just get Mark's / Steven's perspective on these things. People stop all over the city and look up at the sky and go, there's a random eclipse happening right now. We talked about this in the first episode of like, is there going to be this nuance where, is this happening? Is this really happening? Or is this, or is it all in his head?
Steven's head.
Right.
Yeah.
And now it's like,
no, at this point, there is no question because, as you said, the entire city reacts to the eclipse happening.
Yeah.
And the other effect that happens later in the episode.
Exactly.
So Khonshu is definitely a real being that is able to influence the sky as part of his abilities. And he is real.
The nuance was fun while it lasted, but now we're full steam ahead.
Yeah, definitely. And so after that eclipse, we find out that that's basically calling the Ennead for a meeting.
Yeah.
And so all of the gods' avatars get portals that open in front of them and are called to this great meeting inside the Pyramid of Gaza.
Right.
And the first of the avatars we meet is the only one that seems to be friendly to Mark and Khonshu. And her name is Yatzil, avatar of Hathor, who is the goddess of music and love. And so, as you mentioned, we talked about it a little bit near the beginning. We have this Ennead, and in the first episode, Steven talks about the Ennead and how it's 9 gods who are grouped together in this hierarchy. But only 7 gods really get represented in this meeting.
See, I thought it was even less.
Well, I'm including Khonshu and Amit.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
From Mark and from Arthur Harrow.
However, traditionally, Khonshu and Amit aren't part of the Ennead. So
this is true.
Unless they've changed it up for Marvel, out of that original 9, you've got almost half being there in the pyramid, and then the other 2 who are I guess tangential gods. Mm-hmm. I don't know what if the Ennead is like the Justice League or something. Then you have to.
So I looked up who is normally part of the Ennead, and they do have a slightly rotating roster.
So it is like the Avengers.
Yeah, so this is Cap's kooky quartet version that we get in this. But the ones that we get in this meeting are Horus, Isis, Tefnut, Osiris, and Hathor. And all of those are normally part of the Ennead in basically all of its incarnations. The ones that are potentially missing are Atum, Shu, Get, Nut, Set, and Nephthys. Mm. And the fact that Steven specifically said, hey, this banner is missing too,
right,
in the first episode. And in this third episode, we get a meeting where at least 2 of them are missing.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anything to that, if something is going to tie in, and maybe one or more of these other gods will be involved later.
You've got to think that it's deliberate, because they made such a point out of calling out the Ennead and how many of them are represented in that first episode. Mm-hmm. And then, so, you go, hey, there's 9, this poster's wrong. It only shows 7, there's 9. And then to get into the pyramid, and there's either 5 or 7, depending on whether Khonshu and Amit are considered
being counted.
Yeah, being counted. Obviously, there's not 9. Any way you slice it, there's not 9. So I definitely think there's something to that. Yeah, what? I have no idea, but I have a lot of questions about how these, Egyptian gods will be represented in the Marvel universe, like the Asgardian. We've talked about this. The Asgardians are, basically aliens from another realm. And, is that the same thing for these Egyptian gods? Or, they keep calling themselves gods, and as does Loki, or were they just mistaken for gods? Are they from another time, another place? They mention in that scene the overvoid, which is not something I'm familiar with, but he says you need to come back from the opulence of the overvoid, or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. Is that the equivalent of an Asgard for whoever this race of people are? I have no idea, but I'm very curious to find out.
Well, like you said, it's interesting, because in that first Thor movie, Thor kind of says, they took us as gods. For us, magic and science are all the same, and when we showed up, people assumed we were gods. And Loki does, as you said, he does say, I am a god, in various places, when he's being his very boastful self. But unlike the Egyptian gods that we see here, the Asgardians don't seem to really be into the whole worship thing. Whereas these gods are like, well, they abandoned us, they stopped worshiping us, so we left.
Mm-hmm.
They're much more godlike in that way. It seems like a lot of their motivation comes from how humans see them and how they feel about them. And so that's why they decided to go to the Overvoid.
Yeah. The Overvoid, is that something from the comics?
It is something from the comics, yeah. The Overvoid is also referred to in the comics as the Celestial Heliopolis, and is basically a resting place for the gods to hang out and watch over without actively taking part in what's going on in the world.
Maybe similar to Olympus.
Yeah, kind of along those lines. It's kind of a place where all the Egyptian gods can get together and
Party.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we're in this meeting of the Ennead, or at least some portion of it, and we find out that Khonshu was banished because he was too showy, which that eclipse was
Yeah.
definitely an example.
Yeah, it's no surprise really that Khonshu is showy. I mean, we've seen him be very showy, so they seem to have no tolerance for it, which I get. But I can't help but wonder if there's other politics going on here, and maybe if we'll see them in the show.
Well, we do get Khonshu's point of view on this. You know, his feeling is it's not that he was being too showy, it's the fact that he refused to abandon humanity.
Right.
So he thinks he's in the right and that all of the gods should be more involved rather than hanging out in the Overvoid and just sitting back and watching and having their avatars observe. He wants to be more a part of humanity's history.
Yeah.
That seems to be the big disagreement between Khonshu and the rest of the gods, is whether or not they should be actively involved.
Yeah.
And this is also where Khonshu accuses Harrow of trying to bring Amit back.
Poorly.
Yeah. They really should have maybe talked to a lawyer or or something to prepare before they brought the Ennead together and made this accusation, because it does not go well.
No, and right before they even walk through the portal, Khonshu says our argument needs to be unimpeachable or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And then they get in there and their argument basically amounts to he's a bad guy. And they don't even talk about the scarab. They don't talk about, it's woefully unprepared. And not only that, but it feels like there are things they could lay out that they don't.
Yeah, the fact that Harrow comes in and hears the accusation and is like, well, I've been walking around the desert, but if everyone who's walked through the desert is evil, then the list of sinners is huge.
Right.
And it's like, well, that's not answering the question.
Right.
You didn't say, no, I am not trying to release Amit.
Right.
You just prevaricated and reframed the question.
How about, like, he's got Amit's cane. He's, enacting Amit's judgment here on on Earth. He's got the scarab that leads to Amit's tomb. He's got a gathering of people that have conspired to make this happen. Any of that.
Yeah. None of that gets brought up, and the rest of the Ennead doesn't seem to really want to hear it anyways.
Yeah.
Because they very quickly basically take Harrow's side. Harrow says, well, are you going to listen to this disgraced god whose avatar is an unwell man? And they ask Mark, are you unwell? And he says, yes. But that doesn't change things. Harrow's still trying to do this. And they're like, nah, he hasn't done anything yet. Meeting's over.
Right. And that's why I wonder if there's politics going on, because it happens so quickly. Now, again, I don't think they do a good job presenting the case. I don't know if that's due to poor writing or idiot plot. As I know, I'm sure you're familiar with that term. It's just anytime you leave out information that would have quickly resolved the situation. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves. And I'm hoping that this is just, there's something bigger here that we're not seeing. But
yeah, that's my hope as well.
Yeah, because there were a few times in this episode where I was like, writing was a little spotty. But I would hope that if the reason it was wrapped up so quickly is maybe there's something going on. Maybe another one of the gods is conspiring to bring Amit back with Harrow. Maybe they too are missing the adoration, and this would be a way to get attention back on Earth or something. And if that happens, then I'll forgive it. But otherwise, it just seems like this episode to me felt very kind of edited. Obviously every episode is edited, but it felt like things were missing from, like it was quick. We need to get the runtime down. So let's take some stuff out.
Which is odd because it being on a streaming service, they don't have a set runtime that they have to stick to, but it does feel like they're cutting things out just to move things along.
It feels that way.
Yeah. It's a strange decision.
Yeah.
I would rather have a slightly longer episode and get things fully explained that should be explained.
Yeah.
Rather than just get us to the next action scene.
Agreed.
Like you said, I hope that we do find out there is a legitimate motivation for why the gods cut this short and didn't really do any sort of investigation or actual discussion of what was happening.
Or even a hearing of both sides. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but...
No, I would agree that if we don't find out later that there is a reason that they did this, then this is unfortunately poor writing on their part.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it won't be the last nitpick I have with this episode, but I enjoyed the episode. I'm still firmly on board with the series, but...
Oh, yeah. Overall, it's still really good.
Yeah.
But we are starting to see some cracks in the plot.
Agreed. Yeah.
After the Ennead call off the meeting and all go their separate ways, it turns out that Yatzil sticks around and she gives Marc a clue as to where to go next. So if most of the Ennead are working with Amit, it would seem that Hathor is not part of that group because Yatzil, her avatar, is like, hey, there are other options for you. Let me give you this.
Or maybe she's the one that's in cahoots with Amit because, who else shows up and then the very next scene, seemingly out of nowhere, is Harrow. So maybe there's, alternate ways to get there. I mean, again, I don't know if that's bad writing or if it makes sense, but she hints toward a history with Khonshu, but he also seems to not know anything about it. So maybe she's taking advantage of his ignorance and maybe she's the bad guy.
Yeah, possibly. Well, we'll find out eventually, one would assume.
I would hope, yeah.
At this point, one never knows. But Marc does take Yatzil's advice and starts seeking out Senfu's sarcophagus, which apparently is the only person who had information as to where Amit's tomb was located. And so, if he can find Senfu's sarcophagus, then that apparently will lead to Amit's tomb.
Yeah.
And so he starts looking on the black market, basically. But because he's not Egyptian, the black market sellers are not going to talk to him. So it's fortunate for him that Layla shows up at this point.
Again, showing up out of nowhere.
Showing up out of nowhere, but we knew that she was coming to Egypt. We knew that she was looking for Marc. And if Marc is making waves in the black market looking for this specific item, then he's probably going to raise some attention and make it easier to find him.
That's true. It's a good point.
So I didn't have any issues with this meeting between them.
Well, I understand that we need to get on with the program, so it's...
Well, there's that too,
yeah.
Yes. So, obviously, Layla is not happy with Marc/Steven because he went off on his own, but she is willing to work with him at this point and help him in order to prevent Harrow from releasing Amit. She has a lead as to where Senfu's sarcophagus is.
Senfu's sarcophagus, new band name, I call it.
That's all yours.
Thanks.
I'm going to take Amit's tomb.
Okay. We can open for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Senfu's sarcophagus leads to Amit's tomb. So she knows where Senfu's sarcophagus is, and then we get them on the boat together going to Mogart's castle, or whatever
Compound,
you
or
want to, yeah, whatever you want to call that. And we get some nice character building moments. We get to see more of Mark and Layla's relationship. Before we saw Steven and Layla interacting with one another, but now we get to see really what Mark and Layla are like together. And I enjoyed their discussion.
Yeah, I like that scene a lot.
Seeing their relationship.
Yeah, and getting a sense of not only their history but their wounds. And I also enjoyed the fact that we're still seeing, aspects of modern Cairo, and it was just this, aspects and features that you don't normally see represented. And I just really dug the whole scene.
Mm-hmm. Although I kind of wondered where this other family on the boat with them was going. Were they also going to Mogart's place, or was this just kind of a public transportation system?
I assumed the latter, but I assumed that there was, almost like a ferry or something that it's going across the, river or bay, or I don't know where we are, but
I would assume the Nile.
I would make that assumption too, but then I'd wonder if I don't know Cairo enough to know, is that the only large body of water that's nearby, or?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% on that. But after that relationship building conversation, after we get to see the two of them together, we do get to Mogart's place. So let's talk about Mogart a little bit.
Let's talk about Mogart.
Anton Mogart is actually a character from the comics.
Yes. I know this only because the actor passed, and in the write-up, it mentioned that his character eventually in the comics becomes a superhero, supervillain, something.
Villain.
Yeah.
Definitely villain. So Anton Mogart, played by the late Gaspard Ulliel, is an art thief who strikes specifically at midnight for his various crimes, and so goes by the nom de guerre of Midnight Man. And so he's a recurring Moon Knight villain. We don't really get much of that here in the show, although they do have the commonality of being into art and ancient artifacts and being willing to take less than legal actions in order to acquire them.
Yeah, I mean, he makes it sound like he's doing it from a love of antiquities, but obviously he's also not donating them to museums. He's got them on display in his house or
exactly
outside for some stupid reason, and by his horse corral.
I kind of like the glass pyramid. It looked very much like he kind of had his own museum set up, and so they're on display for people to be able to look at, and he can say, look at these lovely antiques I have, these ancient artifacts, and see what I'm doing to preserve Egyptian history, and kind of be a little bit of a show-off, which this character obviously is, because we get introduced to him while he's in the middle of a El Merma tournament that he is putting on himself, or is,
I don't know what that
getting
is, but
lessons on.
Very fancy.
It's an ancient Egyptian fencing competition.
Awesome.
It's probably one of the oldest sports that is still around in its original form, or somewhat close to it. So he's all in on ancient Egyptian practices.
Yeah, I agree with you that he'd be one of those types that would show off and show his things. And it felt to me like, hey, we want to have the sarcophagus in this episode, but we also want to have a horse action sequence. So what if we put the sarcophagus outside by the horse thing? And you just go, oh, okay, well, I guess. But if you give it too much thought, it kind of, for me, I'm like, all right, I guess we got to get through the episode, and you want to do the action stuff. but it seems like a weird place to store an ancient sarcophagus that you but again, that's another nitpick on my part.
Yeah, I can understand that. It is not completely logical that this ancient sarcophagus would be stored or displayed outside.
Right.
But it is still protected from the elements. It's inside a glass pyramid.
It's completely logical from a screenwriting perspective.
Yes.
and a staging perspective, but it,
Yeah.
from a reality perspective, I'm not sure, but whatever. The action was fun.
Yes. But before we get to that action, we get a brief little Easter egg of the greater MCU, because Mogart's bodyguard mentions that the last time Mogart and Layla saw each other was in Madripoor.
Which is cool.
For those who may have missed it, Madripoor is seen in the MCU in the Falcon and Winter Soldier series, and is mostly known in the comics for being a kind of criminal island where the lowest of the low hang out, and was where Wolverine would often go when he wanted to relax in his patch identity, where he looked exactly the same except that he wore an eye patch and had casual clothes rather than an X-Men uniform. And yet somehow nobody knew that this was Wolverine.
Comics are weird.
So Mogart gets off his horse, talks to Layla and Mark, and after some awkward conversation, does let them see the sarcophagus. And again, we get to see that Steven is the expert on Egypt and hieroglyphics, and Mark does not know any of that sort of stuff. He is not helpful when it comes to decoding where Amit's tomb would be.
All right, this is my last nitpick with the episode.
Okay.
They clearly have set up that Steven is a fan, like a fanboy of Egyptian stuff.
Okay.
In the first episode, he wants to be a tour guide. There's a bunch of Egyptian books on his shelves, but he's not an Egyptologist. And suddenly I feel like he went from fanboy in episode 1 to like expert in episode 3. And again, I understand why, because we need to get the episode done and we need somebody that has expertise. But I feel like that was a little bit, he wasn't even qualified to be a tour guide in episode. It was just the gift shop guy.
Well, I don't think he necessarily wasn't qualified, but the boss there found him off-putting and didn't want him to have that job. I don't think it was that big of a leap. Like you said, we see lots of Egyptology books in his flat, and if he's spending every night studying them the way we see in the Staying Awake montage, then he's probably got a pretty good knowledge base to work from.
Again, it's a nitpick, but I think it's the only reason I even bring these things up is because there were 3 times where I'm like, all right, well, that just felt like we need to write ourselves out of this.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there seems to be a little bit more specialized knowledge that we're dealing with here with the sarcophagus than somebody who just has a appreciation for it. But I know I'm still on board. I understand why they did it. I just sometimes I wish this stuff wasn't so clunky,
Yeah. And unlike me, you're a professional writer.
Well,
so
that could be debated, but yes.
You're a published author.
Yes.
I write these episodes for these shows, but that is very different from story and plot.
Sure.
So you probably have much more of an eye for those sorts of things compared to me.
I guess I'm very sensitive about the cheats.
Mm-hmm.
And this episode, the first 2 episodes seemed to be pretty solid. This episode felt like it was, It's that thing where you're like, all right, we've got 6 episodes and we've got this much story to tell. And it's like, all right, we need to get from here to here in this episode and we need to accomplish these things. And how do we do that without taking up an hour and a half? So I understand the reason why they do it. I just, it's sometimes it just feels a little clunky to me. And, I feel like they've got a solid base to build on. And when I start to see these little cracks, it just sends a red flag up. Like, all right, do we know what we're doing here? Are we telling the right story? Or because I really didn't fault the first two episodes for much. This is the first time I really enjoyed it. I've watched it a couple times now. All told, I was really entertained. But I was entertained once I overlooked my quibbles,
Whereas in the first 2 episodes, you didn't have any.
Their quibbles were very, very minor, if any, in the first 2 episodes.
Yeah.
But that's it. I promise.
Okay.
I'm done. I'm done nitpicking now.
Even if it was written not quite up to snuff compared to the last 2, I really enjoyed the interaction between Steven and Marc during this scene.
Me too.
Where Steven is telling him, I'm not going to help you unless you let me out. And it's like, we don't have time for this. The interaction between the two was really well performed. And there's more even later, but Oscar Isaac is still killing it when it comes to
rock solid.
Yeah. But Steven does agree to help decode what needs to be done in order to find Amit's tomb through the information here on the sarcophagus. But unfortunately, when he starts actually moving things around, that's when Beck, the bodyguard, interrupts, and we get sort of a standoff for a second, but then Harrow shows up. We did see when Marc and Layla first arrived that possibly Harrow's men were hanging out just offshore, and so that's confirmed here when Harrow says, basically, don't help them, and I'll give you some real treasure. What did you think of Harrow showing up at this moment?
Well, he has this tendency to kind of pop up wherever he's needed to be. And I'm hoping it's motivated from some sort of actual plot. And again, maybe, if he's getting fed some inside information from one of the other gods or someone else on the inside, or a lot of it can be explained because he's got such a wide network of followers and spies and whatnot. But I'd love to understand that, he was kind of being assisted through this by someone, because again, it's very convenient that he shows up right as they're about to make this transaction, or at least seemingly so, before the standoff takes place.
Yeah. We did get that bit in the first scene right after the Marvel logo where he's told by one of his followers that
yes,
Marc's in Cairo. He's looking for this.
And honestly, I think that's enough to explain in a way that he's constantly getting fed information about the whereabouts of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And that works for me. But I would love to see that, maybe that there was a little bit more to it. He's certainly he's got very convenient timing.
Yes.
He's great at dramatic entrances. So
yeah. And at dramatic dialogue as well, because we get this moment where he kind of intimates to Layla that Marc may have a darker past than he's even told her. And I think that he's trying to tell her without saying it out loud that Marc killed her father.
Yeah, that's what I got. But maybe it's not Marc. Maybe it's this other third personality, Jake, or whoever it is.
Yeah.
Or maybe Marc just didn't do enough to stop it.
Yeah, it could be a few things, but Marc obviously recognizes what he's trying to say and later denies it when they're back in the car later, and is like, oh no, he's just trying to get in your head. It's nothing.
Right, don't let him divide us.
But obviously it is something, because the way he reacts, you can tell that Marc knows.
I think not only is it going to be something, it's going to be the thing that the reason that they're not together, the reason that he's hiding from her, asking for divorce and distant from her. And, I think it's going to be a major thing when it's finally revealed, and probably pivotal for who they both are and who they'll become through the show. And I hope so.
Yeah. Judging by the pacing of things, I would assume that this is going to get revealed next episode.
Yeah, I hope so. that's one thing you can't fault this show for. It's moving quickly, and it's maximizing its episodes for sure.
Definitely. But again, I kind of skipped ahead a little bit, getting to that conversation in the car. But before we get that, we get another big action scene here.
Yeah.
So after Harrow leaves, well, actually, before he leaves, he shows off his power by destroying the sarcophagus just by chanting through the cane. And while he's doing that, before he leaves, Marc takes that opportunity to disappear and reappear as Moon Knight. And we get this fight scene between Moon Knight and Mogart's men. And that moment when Moon Knight jumps down and the cape extends to that full crescent moon shape, that was just...
Yeah, such a good visual.
Straight out of the comics. It's one of those things that, especially for comic book fans as old as I am, it's the kind of thing you never expected to see because it's so true to the comics.
If someone had told you when you were younger that you'd get this level of production around Moon Knight, would you have believed them? I mean, when the first Captain America movie came out, I was like, this is amazing. We're getting a World War II era Captain America, like a legit Captain America movie that's people just don't appreciate how mind-blowing this is, you know, and on a big budget, on a big scale. And you know, and we've gone so far beyond that at this point. The Infinity Stones, and you know, it's just it's crazy to me to think of all the things that I loved growing up and that they're getting represented. I'm like, again, I wasn't huge into Moon Knight, but I love the idea of him. But the fact that we're at this place where Moon Knight is getting such a minor character, a C character, really, is getting such notice from people that, you know, everyone knows who Moon Knight is now because Oscar Isaacs is playing him on Disney Plus, and it's like, wow, this is just crazy.
It's a good time to be a fan.
Yeah, it's a good time to be a geek. Yeah.
But in this fight, we also get to see how powerful Moon Knight is.
Yeah.
Before, we saw that he's super strong and can take some blows from a fall or from being punched, but the fact that he can wrap his cape around Layla and just stand there and absorb all the gunshots and then get stabbed through the chest in multiple places, through and through from multiple spears, and still just stand up, shake it off, and fight back and defeat all of these men. That's a whole lot more powerful than most of the Avengers, really, if you think about it.
How do you feel? I mean, I know that his suit wasn't mystical in the comics, and they've really leaned into that. How is that working for you?
For me, it's working well. I think the fact that he has this mystical origin, that he's connected to the gods, I think that works for putting him at this power level. You know, when he was first created, Doug Mensch left it very open, like, is Khonshu just a hallucination that Marc had when he was near death, or is it really something that happened, and are these gods real? It was left very open-ended for a long time, and wasn't until much more recently that Khonshu really made his presence known in the comics. And since then, Moon Knight has had some moments where he's been much more powerful. There was a recent storyline where Moon Knight was kind of possessed by Khonshu and powered up to a certain extent, but in that storyline, he took on most of the Avengers successfully and was able to defeat them. He took control of Thor's hammer, saying, oh, by the way, your hammer is made of moon rock. Guess what I control?
Interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm in charge of anything moon related, and thus I can take your hammer away. So in the comics, he has had his powers kind of leveled up some, although in more recent solo stories, he's still a street level hero. But we have seen that Khonshu can give him that kind of power. So having it show up in the show isn't too much of a contradiction to what we have seen in the comics.
So it works for you.
It works for me, especially since Khonshu is such a large presence in the show.
Yeah.
And so having a god behind you should make you more powerful than a guy with moon-shaped gadgets.
Yeah, I would think.
So yeah, after this brutal fight, we get another very humorous moment where Steven takes over for a second. And it's like, no, time out.
Let's just chill the F out.
Yeah, can we talk this out? And then all the men come in and stab. Okay, take over. Sorry, no, this didn't work.
Yeah, that was very amusing for me.
Yeah, I laughed at that. We still haven't seen Mr. Knight using the Eskrima sticks. Really.
I thought maybe we would in that scene, but
yeah, I thought we were gonna get some fighting from Mr. Knight there, but not yet. Still to come.
They gotta do it. They gotta do it.
Yeah, but yeah, that fight ends with them being able to take the fabric covering the mummy in the sarcophagus. There was a word for it. I think it was like contouge or something like that. Cartouche.
Did they use that word in the show? I don't recall.
Yeah.
That. Okay.
Yeah. I didn't get the exact word, but the starry fabric that was covering the mummy, they get that even though it's been ripped and torn to pieces, they're still able to get that and take it out into the desert and piece it together, thanks again to Steven and his Egyptology knowledge.
Yeah.
But even with that put together, they're still missing something because it's a map of the stars, but it's a map of the stars 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And as someone who was big into astronomy when he was younger can tell you, like myself, the stars do move.
Yeah, they drift, they change.
Yeah. It's really interesting seeing like what constellations existed during the time of the Greeks or during ancient Egypt or things like that, because what now looks like a hunter back then looked like something completely different.
Right.
And so without the knowledge of what the stars looked like when Senfu made this thing, they have no way of pinpointing where the tomb is. And so Khonshu uses his powers once again to alter the night sky.
And it's a great scene.
Oh, yeah, it's gorgeous. The effects on that, seeing the moon trace those rays through the sky to see how it kind of moves back and forth through the night sky as its orbit shifts slightly, and certain stars kind of going in a figure eight shape as they move and drift through the sky. Yeah, it was beautiful. And we see again the entire city reacting to this. Right. You have to kind of wonder how large of a radius
right
were people in Germany, Italy, or Greece, or if you're north but on the same latitude, is your night sky also moving like that, or was it just happening in Cairo?
Right, because it wasn't happening on a personal basis. It wasn't happening just for them in the desert. So it was definitely happening for the whole city. It makes you wonder if it was happening for the whole world. And again, people going like, what the hell is this? What fresh hell? uh, you know.
Is Superman flying around the Earth backwards again? That's probably not the kind of question that we're going to get an answer for.
I agree.
But it's still fun to kind of theorize and bring it up as a question, just because I'm curious.
Yeah.
What are the limits of Khonshu's power?
Harrow makes a comment in the second episode about him just not being able to do much beyond bluster, basically. And you got to wonder if it's just visual. We're going to see it, but obviously he's not affecting the orbit of the Earth, or maybe he is, but it doesn't feel like he is, like that seems like it would be too extreme.
Yeah. And as Harrow pointed out, he can only do kind of the bluster sort of thing unless Marc or Steven is willing to help.
Yes.
And so it does take Steven doing the hand motions and working with Khonshu in order to have this large effect, and be able to see what the sky was like 2,000 years ago. So yeah, it doesn't contradict what Harrow said, because he does have the assistance of his avatar to have this greater effect.
Something I thought was interesting about this scene, it's just a minor little detail. It's the first time, I believe, in the show that Khonshu has called Steven by name rather than the idiot or a worm or,
parasite.
Parasite. He when he needs his help there in the desert, he says Steven. And I thought, well, I don't know if this is a burgeoning respect for this altered personality, or if it's just, if I'm reading too much into it. But I did think it was interesting that I believe that's the first time that Khonshu has talked directly to Steven and called him by name.
Well, he definitely talked directly to Steven in the past, but yeah, I think you're right that this is
always
the first
derisively.
Time. This is the first time that he kind of gave him the proper due that he's given Marc.
Yeah.
So
I think he even,
that is
and he didn't,
a nice moment.
He didn't ask him to relinquish the body to Marc. I think maybe he even realized that he's the better of the two to have in that moment, that he does have value there.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So yeah, they're able to do this together, but unfortunately bringing that much attention once again calls the gods down, and they make good on their threat to lock Khonshu away in stone. So now Marc and Steven don't have the suit available to them anymore.
Which makes you wonder how much more Moon Knight we're going to get in this Moon Knight show, because he says that his healing armor. So is he going to not have the suit at all, or just not be able to heal, or be protected, or it's because otherwise it's I can't imagine that they're going to get Khonshu released in the next episode. So have we seen the last of Moon Knight in this Moon Knight show?
Well, I would say no. I think we're definitely going to get more Moon Knight. My guess would be that we have next episode is costume free, and that either at the end of this next episode, or maybe even at the end of episode 5, Khonshu will be released. Khonshu even says, Steven, tell Marc to go free me.
To release me.
So I think when Marc/Steven wakes up, because we leave him, the last we see of him, he falls unconscious. But I think when he wakes up, that's going to be his first goal, is to release Khonshu so that he has the power back to be able to be Moon Knight again.
It'll be interesting because there's this other aspect. I mean, even earlier in the episode, Khonshu says, "Tick tock, Marc Spector, tick tock." So we clearly have established that this is a race to the tomb.
Right. There is a definite time limit here.
Yeah. So in some ways, it would be irresponsible for Marc to go like, I'm going to put the tomb thing on hold and go free the god. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how they take it. I have heard, interviews with the cast where they seem to indicate that something, I can't wait to see episode 4.
Yeah, no, I didn't click on it or anything, but I did see a headline where they said episode 4 is going to change everything.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything other than those words.
Yeah.
Oh, it's episode 4 is going to blow you away or something like, I in
Hmm.
passing, just in an interview. So maybe, and again, this show is not wasting any time. Maybe we'll get the race to the tomb in episode 4 and be done with it by the end of episode 4, and maybe there'll be a major shift. And I love that I haven't really been able to completely predict where they're going with everything, so
Hmm.
that's nice, because I feel like there's a tendency to expect that, if the goal is to get to the tomb before Amit, and you kind of have those Raiders feeling, it's like that's the getting to the well of the souls. But even in Raiders, they got there early enough that then it became a race to get the ark back. And I think that they're taking a lot of inspiration from that, so maybe we will get further along in this next episode than I've been suspecting.
Yeah. And again, if you remember last episode where we talked about I'm gonna get the word wrong, but the Abshatu or Abshati, where Layla says this scarab leads to.
Right, yes, that it might not be even the tomb.
Yeah, so we'll have to see. But yeah, next episode should, at least according to everything we've heard, it should be a big one.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited. I nitpicks aside, I'm really enjoying the show very much. So, and Oscar Isaacs is doing such a phenomenal job. I mean, they all are,
Oh,
but
yeah, I meant to call it out earlier. There's the scene in the desert where Mark lets Steven out.
that handoff,
And
yeah,
yeah, and it's the first time that you don't get that, where it all kind of gets choppy and the eyes roll back and all that sort of thing. And it's a clean transition between the two, and you can see in Oscar Isaac's face where that transition happens. You
yes,
can see that's Mark, that's Steven.
yeah,
And the fact that he can do that with just facial expressions is amazing.
yeah. He's
Is
really nailing it.
top-notch
Yeah,
talent. And also hearing the conversation between the two characters, between Mark and Steven, Mark's voice is so much deeper and more gravelly, whereas Steven's is all up in his head. They're completely different characters, and being able to switch back and forth to have that conversation with yourself, it's just amazing work on
yeah.
Oscar Isaac's part. And we're kind of wrapping up here, but there is one last scene that we should talk about, because we get to see Harrow back in the Great Pyramid with one of the other avatars showing him Khonshu's been put in stone. And I thought that was really interesting and does kind of point towards what you were saying earlier of maybe some of these other gods are working with Amit.
Right.
Because if they really thought that Harrow is completely innocent, then would they have a reason to bring him back and say, look, we captured Khonshu?
Right. It does feel like there's some conspiring going on, and I hope there is. I mean, if there's not, I enjoyed that last scene. I enjoyed Ethan Hawke's soliloquy about, about how Khonshu's vengeance forged who he is. That I found that compelling. But I do think it was, again, we've got this race to the tomb, and he's got people digging out in the desert, but he's just popping all around Cairo and into back into this mystical portals to go to the pyramid. And it's like, where are you getting all this time, dude? Like,
well, he's got like a whole army
he
doing
does
all the digging for
no I
him,
know,
so
but
he can go where he needs to. One would assume that the other avatar is the one that opened a portal and said, hey, come on back to the pyramid so I can show you this. Because earlier when Khonshu makes his accusation, Harrow says, "I'm about to be called." So he knows that he has to go to this, but he also doesn't seem to have the power himself to go there. He's waiting to be called.
Yeah.
So I would assume that the other avatar in this last scene is the one who brought him there. And so, again, that to me points to some sort of conspiring between at least that avatar and Harrow/Amit.
Yeah.
But we will have to wait another week until we find out.
I can't wait.
I'm really enjoying my conversations with you.
Likewise.
I've said thank you on the podcast, but I want to make sure to say thank you to you for joining me on this.
Oh, thank you for asking me. I've had a great time, and I can't wait for the next episode.
Yeah, where everything you know changes.
Everything.
On that mysterious note, we wrap up this week's deep dive. Thanks again to John Mulhall for joining me, and don't forget you can find out more about him and his literary work at johnmulhall.com. We'll continue our talk about Moon Knight next week with episode 4, which, having already seen, can tell you definitely contains some surprises. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, either on the show or on topics you want discussed in future episodes. Please send any and all of those via email to welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome-to-geektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcome-to-geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them,
Welcome to Geektown, population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material, their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.